Vegetable oils supply roughly 300 kilocalories per person per day, about 10% of the world's daily caloric intake. Right now, governments on 3 continents are pumping those same oils into fuel refineries. And the math does not work, because by the end of the next decade, the OECD FAO projects that 27% of the world's cereal crops will flow into biofuel and industrial uses, while 18% of all vegetable oil produced on Earth will burn as biomass-based diesel, not sit on a dinner table. July 4, 2025, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act became law. It gutted vast sections of the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, killed consumer electric vehicle credits, and phased out residential green energy rebates. But there was one provision Congress deliberately kept alive and reshaped: the Section 45Z Clean Fuel Production Credit. What 45Z replaced was the old biodiesel blenders tax credit, a $1 per gallon subsidy that rewarded fuel retailers for mixing biodiesel into their product. Under the new structure, that dollar goes upstream to the producer instead, pegged to life cycle emissions scored by the GREET model. And that is where the protectionism kicks in. Starting with any fuel produced after December 31st, 2025, only feedstocks grown in the United States, Canada, or Mexico qualify. Used cooking oil shipped from Asia, soybeans harvested in Argentina, tallow exported from Australia, none of it earns the credit anymore. That single restriction locked domestic renewable diesel producers into a captive North American supply chain, driving up prices for soybean oil, canola oil, and domestic animal fats entirely independent of global markets. On top of that, the legislation stripped indirect land use change penalties out of the emissions formula, which meant virgin soybean oil suddenly qualified for credits at the same level as waste feedstocks, like used cooking oil and tallow. Inputs that had been eating up to 30% of soybean oil's share in the biofuel sector before the law changed. The EPA piled on with its proposed 2026 mandates: 7.12 billion RINs earmarked for biomass-based diesel, 24.02 billion RINs for total renewable fuel, and a separate proposal to slash the compliance value of imported renewable fuels by half. Retailers felt the squeeze immediately. Under the old blender's credit, gas stations pocketed savings and passed them to customers at the pump, which meant cheaper diesel for truckers and commuters. With the incentive now captured by producers who never interact with consumers, fuel marketing associations NACS, NATSO, and Sigma petitioned Congress directly, arguing that the retail blending market had collapsed and diesel prices were climbing as a direct result. Indonesia processes more palm oil than any country on Earth, and its government runs the most aggressive biodiesel mandate in existence. The trajectory tells its own story. B2.5 in 2008, then B20, then B30, and by 2026, the standing requirement sat at B40. 40% palm-based biodiesel blended into every liter of transport fuel sold. Jakarta had shelved the jump to B50 in January 2026. Engine compatibility looked uncertain, and the subsidy fund could not cover the cost. That calculus flipped entirely when the Strait of Hormuz blockade pushed Brent crude past $110 a barrel. The palm oil-gas oil spread, the differential that decides whether biofuel blending makes or loses money, collapsed in favor of palm oil. 1 year earlier, that pogo spread between Malaysian palm oil futures and ICE gas oil averaged $164.8 per metric ton, a massive premium over the $39.8 average from the year before that. The Hormuz crisis wiped out the premium overnight. Deputy Energy Minister Yuliat Tanjung told markets B50 could arrive by the second half of 2026. Running B50 demands an estimated 16 million tons of crude palm oil every year. Under B40 alone, 15.6 million kiloliters of palm oil went to fuel in 2024, up from 13.2 million kiloliters the year before, and the government projected cutting CPO exports by up to 5.3 million tons to feed the upgraded mandate. Between 2020 and 2025, the biodiesel program saved Indonesia $40.7 billion in foreign exchange, and a full B50 implementation carried a projected savings of 179.28 trillion rupiah, roughly $10.84 billion, in a single year. None of that resolves the program's built-in contradiction. The subsidy fund, managed by the BPDPKS, collects its revenue from export levies on outgoing palm oil. In January 2026, the CPO reference price of $915.64 per metric ton triggered a combined levy and duty of $166 per ton. The problem is circular. The more palm oil stays home for biodiesel, the less gets exported, which cuts levy revenue at exactly the moment the program needs more money per liter. Direct domestic subsidies already ballooned from $373 million in 2018 to $3.415 billion in 2021, and they keep growing. Europe layered its own constraints through the Renewable Energy Directive 3. Member states face a binding target of 42.5% renewable energy by 2030, with transportation mandates demanding 70% greenhouse gas savings from existing installations and 80% from new ones. A hard 7% cap on food-based biofuels forces refiners away from traditional crop feedstocks and towards certified waste oils and animal fats. Palm oil faces a near-total phase-out under high indirect land use change risk rules, and soy and canola sit under heavy restriction. European animal fat and used cooking oil prices swung by up to 16.5% on average over the preceding year, as buyers scrambled for any feedstock that still qualifies. March 2026 turned the food versus fuel argument from a policy debate into a physical emergency. When the Strait of Hormuz shut down, it took 20% of the world's seaborne oil and 30% of global fertilizer trade with it. Brent crude blowing past $110 a barrel did something no government mandate could have achieved on its own. It made biofuel blending profitable everywhere, all at once, regardless of local policy. Palm oil prices on the Bursa Malaysia exchange surged nearly 10% in a single session, and CBOT soybean oil futures jumped 5% in the longest continuous rally since the 2008 crisis. The fertilizer side hit even harder. Natural gas feeds the production of nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers, and the Persian Gulf ships massive quantities of both. That supply froze overnight, spiking crop nutrient costs globally and guaranteeing that the next planting season would carry sharply higher input costs, suppressing future yields at the exact moment biofuel refineries needed every drop of oil they could get. WTI crude traveled from $57.97 per barrel in December 2025 to past $85 by early March 2026, a gain exceeding 40% in under 90 days. Wholesale ethanol, meanwhile, traded at 84 cents per gallon below conventional gasoline, a 31% discount, prompting the Renewable Fuels Association to push hard for emergency year-round E15 waivers. Washington responded with force. Navy warships began escorting commercial tankers through the strait. G7 finance ministers coordinated a possible release of up to 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves. More controversially, the administration weighed lifting targeted oil sanctions on Russia to crack the price rally ahead of midterm elections. The last time food and fuel collided this violently, the crisis looked different. Between 2007 and 2008, the Energy Independence and Security Act mandated enormous volumes of corn ethanol, eventually absorbing 40% of total domestic corn production and triggering a global scramble for arable land. By mid-2022, lingering structural effects from that era and the Ukraine war pushed the agricultural price index up 34% from January 2021, with corn inflating 47% and wheat 42%. 2026 is not a grain crisis. It is a lipid crisis, fats and oils, and the lipid market operates on an entirely different set of constraints. Conventional ethanol stalled at the E10 blend wall years ago. All of the new biofuel capacity targets, renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, which consumes soybean oil, canola oil, palm oil, and rendered animal fats. The lipid supply is far tighter and far more expensive to expand than grain. Soybean oil spent decades as a cheap byproduct that processors sold off to recoup costs, and biofuel mandates recast it as the single most valuable output in the multi-billion-dollar oilseed complex. That policy pressure also severed a pricing relationship that held for generations. Soybean oil and palm oil used to move in lockstep, functioning as near-perfect substitutes for food manufacturers worldwide. Since the acceleration of renewable diesel capacity in 2021, that linkage disintegrated. American soybean oil now tracks EPA mandates and the 45Z credit. Palm oil tracks Jakarta's blending edicts and European deforestation regulations. Food companies buying vegetable oil on international markets face a fragmented price structure with no reliable hedge across regions. Inside the soybean processing industry, the renewable diesel boom flipped the economics completely. A bushel of soybeans produces two things when crushed: oil, accounting for 18 to 20% of the weight, and meal, making up the remaining 80%. Before 2020, meal drove 66 to 68% of the total crush value, and oil barely covered its own handling costs. Between 2021 and 2025, oil's share surged to 50%, reaching absolute parity with meal for the first time in industry history. Pre-2020 data showed combined oil and meal price movements explained nearly 80% of raw soybean price variation. During the renewable diesel boom, that explanatory power fell to just 32%. Crush capacity expanded to match. Domestic processing grew from roughly 2.23 billion bushels per year in early 2023 to 2.55 billion by 2025, a 14% jump, with projections exceeding 2.78 billion bushels by 2030. Farmers located within 100 miles of new mega facilities saw local cash bids improve by up to 23 cents per bushel. The catch is that maximizing oil output floods the market with massive volumes of excess soybean meal. Econometric work confirms this. A 1% biofuel-induced increase in soybean oil prices correlates with a 0.30% drop in meal prices. Poultry and swine operations, which depend heavily on meal for protein rations, benefited directly from cheaper feed. Poultry production climbed to successive annual records, and domestic pork output pushed past 28 billion pounds. Cattle tell a completely different story. The U.S. herd dropped to 86.2 million head at the start of 2026, the lowest count since 1951, and because it takes up to 3 years from a rancher's decision to retain a heifer to the eventual slaughter of her offspring, supply cannot snap back quickly. Feeder steer prices averaged a record $240 per hundredweight. The calf-to-feeder spread ballooned to $109 per hundredweight, up from a 2020 to 2024 average of just $31. Should the fertilizer shock push corn prices materially higher, feedlot margins face outright destruction. $76.7 billion. That is the estimated excess fuel cost that the renewable fuel standard imposed on American consumers over a 10-year period. In 2017 alone, adjusting for the fact that ethanol contains roughly 2/3 the energy of gasoline per gallon, the mandate cost drivers $5 billion more than straight unblended fuel would have. 1/3 of the nation's 92 million acres of corn went to ethanol plants instead of food markets. Independent merchant refiners absorbed $5.8 to $19.3 billion annually in RIN compliance costs, and the price swings in that credit market drove a major Philadelphia-based refinery into bankruptcy in 2018. Brazil's version of the story produced a 37% collapse in fuel consumer surplus and a 39% expansion in sugarcane producer surplus. Indonesia's BPDPKS collected $2.3 billion in export levies in 2022, funneling every dollar into domestic blending subsidies, and the foreign exchange savings hit 120.54 trillion rupiah in 2023, and an estimated 123 trillion in 2024. These numbers look like wins for the national treasury, but the distributional impact runs in the opposite direction. Brazilian data shows 37.9% of households face food insecurity, and 12% live in absolute poverty. The poorest families spend 9.58% of total expenses on transport, while average households spend 18.1%, a share that rivals food spending at 17.5%. Each time blending mandates push diesel prices higher, urban bus operators either raise fares or cut routes, and the people who can least afford alternatives absorb the damage. USDA projections for 2026 placed food-at-home inflation at 2.5%, but the 95% prediction interval stretched from -1% all the way to 6.2%. Beef and veal carried a midpoint estimate of 5.5%, with the upper bound reaching 14.4%. Egg prices, by contrast, pointed toward a 27.4% decline as the poultry industry recovered from avian influenza outbreaks. Farmgate commodity costs account for only 14 to 15% of what consumers pay at the grocery store. Everything else is labor, freight, packaging, energy, and rent. Biofuel mandates, however, stack the cost twice. First, they elevate the raw feedstock price by diverting crops into refineries. Second, they raise the wholesale cost of the diesel that trucks burn to deliver those groceries, because refiners pass compliance credit costs straight through to fuel buyers at a pass-through coefficient of 1.01, meaning a 10-cent increase in RIN costs adds 10.1 cents to wholesale diesel. OECD FAO simulations put a number on the solution. Cutting biofuel feedstock use by just 20% during extreme events dampens global food price shocks by 53 to 67%. A 50% cut can fully offset price spikes on staples like maize and wheat. Several variables carry the power to invalidate every projection above. A rapid diplomatic resolution in the Middle East that crashes crude back to $60 or $70 a barrel would wipe out discretionary blending margins overnight, dragging the entire vegetable oil complex downward and stranding billions in recently expanded crush infrastructure. A regulatory reversal poses equal risk. In 2025, the EPA cleared a backlog of 191 small refinery exemption petitions, released 1.4 billion RINs into the market, and collapsed D4 and D6 credit prices, idling biodiesel facilities and crushing agricultural margins in the process. Severe weather remains the wild card. Mandates compel a fixed volume of biofuel production, regardless of how much grain or oilseed the fields actually produce, and a drought that decimates harvests forces the entire deficit onto the inelastic food and feed sectors. Then there is the trade dimension. U.S. soybean exports to China historically account for up to 60% of total export volume, and a renewed trade war imposing prohibitive tariffs could send futures prices down more than 11%, turning the domestic renewable diesel industry from an environmental program into the only viable outlet for American soybeans. 11 million metric tons. According to the International Food Policy Research Institute, that is how much vegetable oil the EPA's proposals threaten to divert from food markets into fuel markets, an amount equal to the annual caloric needs of 100 million people. Each metric ton of vegetable oil burned as biodiesel represents enough calories to sustain more than 10 million people for a year. The price of cooking oil no longer tracks weather or dietary trends. It tracks carbon credit algorithms, environmental legislation, and military conflicts playing out thousands of miles from the fields where the crops grow.